the sense in which ideas in this oligarchical system, which we call, democracy, tend to prevail over good ideas is that the bad ideas are empowering. Even if these ideas actually harm these victims, which I would argue, they do, they feel good. And the society that we're living in, that promotion of bad ideas has gotten so strong that the bad ideas are now able to use authoritarian techniques to repress the good ideas. The mechanism that basically creates that coordination of ideology is promotion rather than suppression. It's attraction rather than repulsion. What about these unbiased, experts? But the thing is, you give power to the experts and power corrupts them. And suddenly they develop these conflicts of interest. They become sort of corrupted. And basically, when you give power to the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of ideas corrupts itself. And you get basically a world of absolutely terrible.
Our brilliant guest today has gone from an anonymous blogger to one of the intellectual godfathers of the so-called new right. Curtis Yarvin, welcome to TRIGGERnometry.
Thank you so much. And I'm enjoying being here and being in the UK.
Well, it's great to have you on the show. We'll get into whether new right is the right term. But before we do that and all the rest of it, tell us, who are you? How are you where you are? What's been the journey that brings you to be sitting here?
Well, I'm an American, and here I am. I just turned 50 years old, and it's been a rather strange and interesting journey. I actually grew up as what we call a foreign service brat. So I grew up as a child of the American Foreign Service. In case you don't know the Foreign Service, I believe you have one of your own. We go around the world and rule it essentially. And, perhaps one of my...
We used to do that here.
Yeah, well, you still help us. You're still useful, for this and that. And perhaps in terms of formative, intellectual experiences, perhaps my most formative moment was when I was 15 years old and my father was consul in Oporto. They have very, very fine wine there. And I was reading his unclassified cables back to America, and he used to have me proofread them. And I'm reading these cables, and it suddenly struck me that the relationship between the U.S. and Portugal, although on paper it's a symmetric relationship, there's something asymmetric there. And I sort of realized that actually the purpose of the U.S. diplomatic mission in Portugal is not to relate between equals. We have this treaty that says if Portugal is attacked, perhaps by Morocco or Spain or even the Soviets, America will come to its defense. But also if America is attacked by Canada or Mexico, for example, Portugal will help defend us. And I'm like, actually, why are there 50 Americans, some of the best Americans in the world, in Portugal? I mean, wonderful people in the Foreign Service. I have only praise for them. But their mission is clearly to, in fact, supervise the government of Portugal. And so to basically sort of go from this worldview of this worldview of the Cold War liberal that I grew up in, reading the International Herald Tribune, the Economist, and suddenly I'm like, this is an empire. And Thucydides would have recognized it as just as unequal as the Delian League. And that sort of sparked, I stored that away, for a number of years. I'm actually a retired computer programmer, computer scientist, some people might even say, although. And after 2000, I started working on a computer science research project. And, research is hard. You read a lot of books. And, to pass the time when your brain isn't on the computer science. And I started to sort of really through the reading of libertarians such as Mises and Rothbard's student, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, I don't know if you know the name. He wrote this book, Democracy, the God That Failed. And, he was a libertarian, but he's sort of bringing in this worldview from kind of before the democratic revolution and really opening you to the very difficult question of how our ancestors would see us. We have this picture of our ancestors, but we've seldom reversed the question. We know what we think of Elizabeth I. Well, what Elizabeth I think of us? We're sitting here right next to Westminster Abbey. What would she think? What would she say if she could see Britain today? And our attitude toward the past, as I started to read the writers of the past, I got into, I'm a huge admirer of Thomas Carlyle, who's now, very unknown and very misunderstood. And as I started to sort of read the past, I started to get a sense of kind of stepping outside, whether it's the Overton window or Plato's cave or whatever. I started to get a sense of how the past would see the present. We live in a time that considers itself very, very superior to all of human history in a number of respects. And, when you look at our cell phones, our computers, these things are sort of clearly superior. But are we as superior as human beings? Are our values and perspectives superior? This seems to me to be a subject well worthy of debate. And especially what started to concern me is that there's almost a sort of provincialism to the present, because when you're in a very provincial society, you tend to be very centered on where you are, and you dismiss sort of the rest of the world as heathens, barbarians, and, you seldom, in this sort of provincial context, you basically seldom sort of flip the script and say, what would they think of us? And to be sort of cosmopolitan in the present is to be able to flip that script and think, this is how we see the Mongolians, but this is also how the Mongolians see us. And so, to answer the question of how the Elizabethans would see us, of how Shakespeare would see the present, it sort of opened up this kind of vast, unopened field of thought. And I felt that, in a way, by starting to think this way, I felt myself, sort of, as one might say, exiting the matrix. And, the thing that I'm kind of most notorious for in some ways is back in 2007, I was sitting in a cafe in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. It's called the People's Cafe, Coffee to the People. It was covered with 60s, propaganda from that time. And I was thinking about, this great movie, The Matrix. And I was like, and of course, when we think about kind of breaking our frames, as I was taught to think, of course, you grow up in the 20th century, and I'm very much a child of the 20th century. You grow up thinking of your, breaking your frames as sort of a revolt against traditionalism. And to sort of take that and flip it around and turn it into a revolt against the present seemed like a very subversive act. And so I started to use this metaphor from The Matrix of the red pill. And now everyone, has this metaphor of being red-pilled or whatever, which, actually this metaphor was far too powerful for me. It was wrested from me immediately in two directions at the same time in my very abstruse content. They broke open the pill. They dumped out my, very abstruse, criticisms of Carlyle and whatever. And it was replaced, one by the pickup artist community, who started to talk about being red-pilled in terms of seeing the, the truth about women or whatever. And then, of course, by, full-on Nazis, or rather neo-Nazis, or post-Nazis, or, the party office is no longer issuing membership cards, but, the term is still used. And so it's sort of, I obviously, I'm not going to take credit for everything that's described as red-pilled.
It became more mainstream than either of those two eventually as well.
Yes. Eventually it became sort of more generalized and mainstreamed, and now it's lovely because it means almost nothing. But, and at the same time, and this would have definitely happened without me, a lot of people, as sort of the ideas of the 1960s kind of hardened, out of their kind of original freshness, because these ideas felt very fresh, 50 and 60 years ago, kind of hardened into a kind of orthodoxy. And so people were looking for ways to controvert that orthodoxy, to deny it, to sort of push back against it, especially in sort of anonymous places on the internet. And so you got this sort of world of like 4chan. You're familiar with 4chan. I was never a 4chan person, but, there was a lot of sort of seething ferment of, how strongly people in that could basically spit in the face of the powers that be. And the people, who the people in that world, which is a world I sort of, I respect people in a lot of ways who are sort of performative dissidents who have this kind of purely negative, nihilistic vision. But there actually, I think, has to be something more than pure nihilism. When you're in an orthodoxy, nihilism is sort of very attractive. And I think that one of the things that happens, all around the world is kids go to these schools and, they sort of receive this content which strikes them as very wrong and very disturbing. And at a certain point, they go to their teacher and they say, maybe in deep confidence, I don't believe in any of this stuff. It seems wrong. It seems very strange. This obsession with race seems very odd and very unpleasant. And we're taught, at the same time in the US to believe we have these two concepts of equal protection of the law and protected classes. How do these things, interact? It's very Orwellian. But, if I don't believe in this, what do I believe in? And the teacher says to them, well, it's very simple. The opposite of this is being a Nazi. And at that point, your 15-year-old says, well, then I'm a Nazi. And I'm using the British pronunciation, just because I'm here in the UK. And that's a sort of like that antagonism where basically you're part of the kind of stereotyped, you're sort of, when you do that, and, I like to warn people against that choice, because it's not that to be a Nazi is to be too radical. Actually, I think you must be much more radical than that. But it's like the sort of, you're inhabiting this caricatured opposition to the frame, whereas actually to be outside the frame is much bigger and much more interesting, and the past is much more enormous.
Let's talk about that. So I want to give you an opportunity to also clarify what you said, being more radical than a Nazi. What are you talking about?
So, I would say, for example, that, to take Shakespeare seriously is much more radical than being a Nazi. And so, when you look at the world of Elizabeth I, it's a world that when we take it seriously, we can barely understand. So, for example, it's a digression, but I happen to be like many very intellectual people. I happen to be an Oxfordian. I believe that Shakespeare was the Earl of Oxford. And so, for example, to take the world of Elizabethan court poetry seriously, and there's a wonderful speech in Troilus and Cressida where Ulysses sort of has his kind of defense of inequality and his defense of rank and his defense of like nobility. You'll not find an ounce of democratic sentiment in Shakespeare. Whereas, for example, Hitler is a demagogue. He's a very, and if you look at, for example, the relationship between Hitler and the kind of the German nationalist right, great writers like Ernst Jünger, who, there's recently, do you know Jünger? There's recently been a Jünger revival, amazing writer. And these people look down upon Hitler as a sort of peasant, and anti-Semitism, in German society in 1900, was a sort of peasant belief. The idea that it could become a serious thing that would result in serious consequences for people was unthinkable to these German aristocrats. And so, for example, if I, place myself in that time, I'm sort of with much more with a kind of Stauffenberg, kind of the old German aristocratic right, who eventually tried to blow up Hitler with a bomb and failed. And Jünger himself is almost caught up in these purges and killed. But Ernst Jünger, Ernst von Salomon, Friedrich Reck, some people you probably haven't heard of, those for me are the writers to read from the time. And so to say, for example, that you're an anti-Nazi, you could basically say, okay, if you're an anti-Nazi, you could be a Stalinist. My own grandparents in America were Stalinists. They were Jewish communists of Russian origin, I think, like some of your ancestors. In fact, I believe our names end with the same last two letters. And so to say that you're not a Nazi, it's like, one of my favorite things to explain is the word Gentile. Because when we use the word Gentile, it's a negative set. It means that you're not a Jew. Or in Utah, it means that you're not a Mormon. Actually, you and I could go.
I was just in Utah, but they didn't tell me that.
You are a Gentile in Utah.
Interesting.
And regardless of your ethnic origin, you're a Gentile because it means you're not a Mormon. So you're not a Mormon. You could be a Hindu. You could be a Zoroastrian. And so, to say, what did Gentiles think? What is Gentile thinking? Is, fundamentally a parochial and false categorization. So to say what do anti-Nazis think? You could be a Stalinist, you could be an American liberal, you could be Ernst Jünger or Julius Evola. And so to sort of expand, basically, once you say, going back to my example of the 15-year-old kid, to say, okay, I'm not woke, I'm post-woke, whatever. What does that mean? This word woke dates to 2012 as though we invented these ideas in 2012, which is absolute nonsense. They were being taught in American universities in the 70s. They were actually, go back solidly to the 30s. And, so to say that I'm not this, once you say that not this means that, you're sort of making the mistake of saying Gentiles believe this.
Right.
Yeah.
And to escape from that pattern and say, no, actually, to say, I don't believe, for example, to say, the meaning of I don't believe in democracy, that can have a huge number of meanings. But to group, for example, Hitler and Elizabeth I, either of whom believed in democracy, I can't imagine that, Queen Elizabeth would have let that little man in her presence for more than a few minutes. And so sort of, it's so crucial to basically say, okay, I'm escaping from this, dichotomy, and even to sort of view this dichotomy as kind of a single line and say, okay, well, I don't believe in woke, but I'm not Hitler, but let's go, 10% toward Hitler. I'm a moderate,
Yeah.
As they say, the best way to fight, radical racist terrorism is to support moderate racists. And oh no, wait, they don't say that. and so there are all these other different fascinating, amazing directions to go to when you kind of let yourself out of the very narrow prison of the present and kind of into the past. And so, when I speak, I of course like to, kind of red pill people who are kind of living within this very constrained intellectual universe and say, you can get outside this, but, I also like to speak to the Nazis. And, I want to say, actually, there's a sort of paucity of imagination. And there's a sort of, when you do that, you're kind of remaining within the frame. And it's very important to sort of leave that frame. And so, like my example of the 15-year-old, the brilliant 15-year-old kid who becomes a Nazi, which I've seen millions and millions of cases of, okay, not millions, but very many. And it's sort of very sad because you get sort of trapped in that space. And especially you're sort of looking for what is the most taboo belief in the modern world. You end up in anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. Well, the Holocaust is one of the best attested facts, in history. But if you're looking for the truth about World War II, actually, almost every other World War II conspiracy theory is true, except Holocaust denial. And so President Roosevelt had prior knowledge of Pearl Harbor, totally believed this, for example. I don't want to go into details on this, but, and so when we understand this sort of enemy, like if you look at kind of pop history, professional history, kind of studies of the Third Reich, we understand it clearly as glass. We see Hitler almost perfectly. Understanding Stalin, have you read, there's a recent book, Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin that came out, a lovely history, kind of a revisionist history or someone, but impeccably academic of, sort of Stalin's perspective in the war, kind of recapitulates the icebreaker hypothesis.
Oh, yeah. What? It's funny because that is, there's most conspiracy theories I think are complete nonsense, but there's a few Russian writers, and the one you're talking about has actually been bettered.
Yeah.
He's been bettered by other people,
Yes.
including Solonian, who, that's a legit thing that Stalin wanted to stab Hitler in the back. That's why they signed in on aggression.
Yes. And I happen to also believe that FDR had prior knowledge of that. And there's no way to prove it. Can't be proved. Only circumstantial evidence. And so the thing is, when you sort of go back and kind of look at that period, again, when you're just like, okay, something smells funny, I'm a Nazi, you're just missing all of this subtlety and all of this, actually this amazing history. You can read Charles Beard, President Roosevelt in the Coming of the War. Charles Callan Tansel was the leading American diplomatic historian of the time. He was granted unfettered access to State Department papers. He wrote Backdoor to War, which is basically like, FDR organized this war, which killed, was it good for the Jews? As one says, right? And so, this is sort of tremendous catastrophe. Actually, the book that I recommend, the writer Nicholson Baker?
No.
Amazing American writer, novelist. He's written fiction, nonfiction, really one of America's great writers. And he wrote this book about 15 years ago called Human Smoke. And Human Smoke is a history of World War II told in chronological tweet-length excerpts from primary sources. It's amazing. And, you come away from this, and if there's just one thing that I kind of want people to believe about World War II, it's that it was not a Marvel movie. It was not in any sense a Marvel movie. There's no Marvel movies. History, World War I, my gosh, is certainly not a Marvel movie. And so, when you step outside of this material, you really, really, really need to step outside of this sort of, linear, here I'm a progressive, here I'm a Nazi. And, by the way, when we use the word progressive, my grandparents actually were American communists. They were Stalinists, to be exact. And they met at a Communist Party meeting, I believe in the late 20s or early 30s. And they were Stalinists all the way through the 70s, which took a lot of persistence. I feel like I have to apologize to your forebears for
You're not responsible for the sins of your ancestors.
Yes.
Keep trying to make the point on
there
other
you go.
issues.
There you go. I don't believe I'm responsible, but it provides a certain
I'll take the reparations.
It provides a certain accountability for sort of understanding what went on. And I only learned that they were so secretive. It was such a secretive time. I only learned that my grandparents were communists from my parents. My grandparents themselves would never talk about it. The word they used instead was progressive. They only said progressive. And if you go back, there's a wonderful resource called Marxist.org. It's about this fellow, Karl Marx, but it includes a lot of sort of leftist, archival material from the past. And you can go and read the pages of The Communist, which was the official journal of the CPUSA, and you can look at the way they used the word progressive. And they used it in exactly the same way to describe the same set of people. It is always a positive word. It always means our friends. And so in a way, when you use the word progressive, without realizing it, today, the old left becomes the new left. So the old left in America is the kind of party left. It's centralized. And the new left, which consists largely of, the term red diaper baby that we use in the US, red diaper baby means sort of a child of the party world. And so like my father, for example, is a red diaper baby. And and the new left basically kind of takes kind of the value system of 1930s communism, and it becomes a decentralized thing. There's no longer a party. It's now this sort of movement that sweeps through society. But if you look at the connections between what people who were communists in the 1930s, and everyone cool in the 1930s was a communist, almost exclusively. And it was just an amazing group of people. I mean, they were brilliant. They were like, when I try to explain 30s communism to people today, I'm like, okay, maybe you went to gifted school, maybe you're a little smart, you're watching, a very intellectual podcast, probably, you've got a little bit up top. Imagine all the gifted kids in the world decided to form a party to take over the world. That was American communism. An amazing, amazing experience. And what this experience sort of, devolves into is, first of all, it becomes like progressivism, and people sort of forget where progressivism comes from. There's this sort of history of American anti-communism, which sort of takes on these kind of nationalist overtones and thinks of it as like this, sort of infection stemming from Moscow. I'm like, how to get to Moscow? how to get to Moscow. In of course, because of course in Russian intellectual history, you have the spectrum of Easternizers versus Westernizers. So on the one hand, you have Lenin, Nechayev, Kropotkin, people like that. And on the other end, you have Dostoevsky, Povedonosev. Do you know Povedonosev? You do.
I know the dichotomy that you're talking about.
Yes.
I'm just aware that Francis hasn't asked a question about how.
You can hear me.
I'm really enjoying. First of all, it's because I'm really enjoying you talk about it, and I'm really enjoying the way that you analyze what has happened, and it's through a very different lens. I guess my question to you, Curtis, is: you've identified the problems.
Yes.
So, what is your vision?
What is my vision?
Hey, KK, do you believe in spring cleaning?
Yes, but only when my wife does it. In Russia, men who clean are executed for not being real men, which is correct.
Well, for those men who are living in the 21st century, Manscaped has an incredible offer for you. Manscaped are the global leaders in men's below-the-waist grooming and have forever changed the grooming game with their amazing performance package 4.0.
Inside this care bundle, you'll find their Lawnmower 4.0, trimmer, weed whacker, ear and nose hair trimmer, crop preserver, ball deodorant, crop reviver toner, performance boxer brief, and a travel bag to hold your goodies.
This elite trimmer is designed to trim hair on loose skin. Although your huevos might look like a couple of Boris Johnsons, treat them with respect and benefit from their proprietary skin-safe technology.
Complete your grooming game this spring with the new refined cologne signature scent by Manscaped. This stuff is legit and will have you smelling like royalty. The good kind, not Prince Andrew.
Get 20% off and free shipping with the code TRIGGER20 at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping with the code TRIGGER20 at manscaped.com. It's time to throw out all your old hygiene habits and upgrade your life.
So my vision is essentially to see the present as sort of continuous with the past. And my vision is to kind of, in a way, break out of kind of not even, the progressive, the 20th century revolution, but really to ask questions about the 19th century revolution and the 18th century revolution. And so, for example, one of my favorite writers is, named Joseph de Maistre. So de Maistre is, he was trained as an Enlightenment man. He was trained basically in the school of Voltaire. And he basically sort of, criticizes the French Revolution from his somewhat safe position as a minister in Savoy. And, to sort of find the French Revolution discussed in a book, published in 1797 that could as well apply to the Russian Revolution, to sort of, even although so much of the 20th century bloodthirstiness has vanished, which is, I think, absolutely wonderful. We're very peaceful people. And, this is one of the reasons why I can imagine kind of very great political change happening in a peaceful way, whereas most people see it as sort of violent. Imagine sort of, the fall of the Soviet Union from the perspective of a 1920s Bolshevik, of like the era of like war communism. They could have never imagined that this enormous thing would disappear without a fight, or that you would see sort of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, because they would have been the ones that physically suppressed it with great enthusiasm.
That's right. And if you'd asked basically, and this is why I'm sort of, in a way of leading up to, this answer, is that most people imagine a kind of political change like this only coming, at the expense of great violence. And if you'd asked, and I don't believe that's necessary or desirable, even possible. And if you'd asked basically the Bolshevik of the 1920s to look at the events of 1989 to 1991, he would have been very confused, because what he would have seen is this, basically the fall of the Soviet Union was brought about by a windbag and a drunk, that is Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Sometimes I think Yakovlev was most of the ideas of glasnost and perestroika came from Yakovlev. These are not great individuals. These are not violent individuals. There's a crowd of a few thousand people in front of the Russian presidential palace. et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this old Bolshevik would be like, well, where's the Soviet youth? Where's the Komsomol? What is the Komsomol doing? How many people are in the Komsomol? And you'd be like, well, there's about 100,000 people in the Komsomol. And where are they? Why are they not fighting for Soviet power? It's like, well, they mainly joined the Komsomol to get jobs. And so sort of all of the energy and power in people who are like progressives today don't really realize where this came from. And so the ability for these kind of, intense revolutions to kind of collapse completely in a way and to sort of lose their force, is fairly considerable. And so, to answer your question very directly, I'm a monarchist. I used to say I was a royalist to, distinguish myself from the people here who believe in costumes and so on. What we have is this, in this country, what you have in this country is this kind of costume monarchy, which is purely symbolic in nature. And, one of the questions I ask is very simply, what would Elizabeth I have thought of Elizabeth II? And, and that's once you put yourself in that framework, the answer is obvious. So when I say I'm a monarchist, I'm a believer in essentially absolute, though accountable monarchy, which strikes everyone as very, very strange.
How would an absolute... Sorry, Frank.
So, yeah, I was going to say, so let's look at the globe.
Mm-hmm.
So who would be your idea of an effective absolute monarchy? Are we talking about something like Saudi Arabia? Are we talking about the UAE, the Crown Prince?
These are very foreign. One of the difficulties is that you have to go to sort of very foreign countries to look for an equivalent at the sovereign level. So, if you're looking at 20th century political leaders who are essentially monarchs who I admire greatly, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, who is in a way an Englishman, he's a sort of Englishman, is because Singapore is the strange half Asian thing, did an amazing job with that country. Deng Xiaoping, is arguably the greatest leader of the 20th century. If you look at kind of the transformation of China under his leadership, he takes this absolute crap power that's created by Mao, who was a nut, an absolute nut. And then, the power of Mao, he's an absolute nut. And like Stalin, the revolution needs its own. He needs to destroy kind of all the people who brought him to power so that he can rule alone. And Mao is this, crazed Chinese emperor. And somehow through the turmoil of Chinese politics, he's replaced by this intensely practical person, Deng Xiaoping, who sort of turns this deranged third world country into, as I look around this room, think about all the things in this room that were made in a monarchy. Those cameras made in a monarchy. Can you make that in Britain? No.
You could.
You could.
It'd be a lot worse and cost 7 times as much.
It would be a lot worse and would cost a lot more.
Yeah.
And this must remind you at a certain level, again, of the late Soviet Union. There's a wonderful, so do you know the director Krzysztof Kieslowski?
I don't.
He did the Three Colors. Poland, communist Poland had this great film tradition, right? And Kieslowski was trained under the communist system. He later, he went to France. He's one of the great directors of our time, but he did this film Blind Chance. And in Blind Chance, there's a lovely scene where a Polish communist bureaucrat has gone to Paris. These visits to the West were like jealously guarded. And one of the things you did when you visited the West was, of course, to shop. And he's brought back from Japan a solar calculator. And there's a scene of these, it's like the 80s. And there's a scene of these 80s communist apparatchiks just looking at this solar calculator and thinking, we can't do that. And so, when you look at, China, for example, I'm from California, we're trying to build high-speed rail there. If you look at a map of the Chinese, subway system, the high-speed rail system, it's like a cancer sprouting. In California, they've been trying to build a high-speed rail line between San Francisco and Los Angeles.
But hang on a second,
Yes.
Curtis. So you're talking about innovation here. Look, but what about the Uyghurs? What about the Uyghurs? What about
the Uyghurs? And so, when you look at, and this is one of the points about 20th century, monarchies, essentially, is that when you look at 20th century monarchies, or as we like to say, dictatorships, and you're seeing essentially, you see all of these kind of atrocities. And basically, one of the things that, Lord Acton, a great Englishman, said that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I used to believe that. I used to be a kind of a classical liberal, even a libertarian. And I started to realize at a certain point why, you have, these sort of new monarchies, these fascisms in the 20th century, Hitler being the worst. Probably, the best of the 20th century fascist leaders is Salazar of Portugal. And Salazar is a very, like a very mild fascist, but he still has a secret police. He still has, and if you're even in Mussolini's, Italy before the war, if you're, an anti-fascist in Mussolini's Italy, you get like sent to an island, and it's not Auschwitz, right? And so, the like sense of, the reason, when you say like, what about the Uyghurs, for example, you're basically looking at a regime which is insecure at a certain level. And it's basically...
But aren't all regimes insecure at a certain level, Curtis? Surely.
All regimes are insecure at a certain level. And basically, when you look at, say, Elizabeth I, for example. So Elizabeth I is under constant threat of being assassinated by Catholics. Mm-hmm. There are many, Jesuitical plots against her. And, the consequence of this is that, to be a Catholic in Elizabeth's Britain is no easy time. Actually, there are many features of Elizabethan England that make us think of dictatorships today. There's censorship of the press. There's a play by Ben Jonson, Isle of Dogs, which is lost because it lampooned sort of powerful figures. And yet also when we look at these, at Elizabeth's England, we're not looking at a world like Stalin's Russia, where anyone could get in trouble for any reason, often completely spurious. We're not looking at a world like, there were plenty of Catholics in, she didn't send Catholics to the Gulag. And so, this is sort of, she didn't send Catholics to the death camps. But if they tried to plot to assassinate her, that was going to be a problem. And so, it's sort of, tempered by the kind of level of insecurity there. And that level of insecurity also, we're very fortunate to live in a relatively, nonviolent age. And so when you look, for example, at the Uyghurs, of course, they're a Central Asian people, and like many people around the turn of the century, kind of a lot of Saudi money and sort of went in, and they developed a terrorist movement there, which I think what really kicked that off was this, a bunch of Uyghurs went to, I forget what city, on a train station and like started massacring people with knives. And the response of the Chinese government is not, certainly it's not, this is of course post-Deng, it's not a response that, sort of matches what I would do. At the same time, basically, there's another country which has a land border with China, which is Afghanistan. And, and when you look at basically the U.S. approach to Afghanistan, and you're like, okay, would I rather be a Uyghur in, Xinjiang, or would I rather be live in Afghanistan for 20 years of war and watch this being done the American way, in which we spend $2 trillion and countless lives of ours and theirs to basically take Afghanistan from the Taliban and give it to the Taliban.
Hold on, but that isn't the comparison we're talking about. We're talking about a Chinese-style authoritarian system versus the system we have in the West, right?
The system we have in the West is a system for governing Western people. And so basically, when we say the reason, these countries are neighbors, they're very similar cultures. And so, when we're sort of comparing apples to apples, actually it's a very apples to apples comparison to look at the Western system of governing, Afghanistan and the Chinese system of governing what is, after all, really a Chinese colony of Xinjiang.
I just don't want to get sidetracked into that. Let's stick with the West, right? Because
Let's stick with the West.
Okay.
Let's stick with the West. And so, let's sort of take this. You use the word authoritarian. And the word authoritarian is a very interesting word because when you get into kind of basic, sort of, again, pre-Enlightenment political science, you're reading like Aristotle and so forth. There really isn't anything in political science that Aristotle didn't understand. And, one of my, basic beliefs or core beliefs, we sort of have this belief in like limited government. For example, today, every government is unlimited. Every sovereignty is absolute, sovereignty is conserved. And when you say, there's, a limited government, I just, spoke, okay, in America we have freedom of speech in theory. That's a British tradition. I just spoke with someone this morning who is being investigated by the police. He's facing 14 years in prison for satirical tweets. And, of course, this is, people being prosecuted for the tweets. Is that a very common thing here?
Because I understand what you're saying, and these are all good points that we've covered on the show plenty. So the fact that Western governments are violating some of arguably the sacred principles of their own societies is a problem, and I agree with you.
But I want to make a different, it's a different point.
But we mustn't compare that to what we actually mean when we say the word authoritarianism.
I think, yes, and I think there's actually, there's a very important point there. And, the sort of the difference, as I understand it, you describe yourself as a classical liberal, and so you see these kind of principles of...
I don't think I ever have, but it's not too far away from
It's not too far, too far away. And so... from the perspective of most people who see this like woke authoritarianism or whatever, they kind of identify it as a somewhat new thing. Certainly, I remember kind of the freedom of speech on the internet in the 1990s when you felt that anyone could say anything for any reason and no one cared. And we've come to a very different place from that. And so understanding the causes of that and saying, are the causes of that deeper than this kind of, superficial question of how do we get past wokeness? How do we roll the clock back to the 90s? And
Well, you're not going to roll back the clock to the 90s. And I think it's partly a technological issue, right? What the internet did is it changed the way we communicate. And so the authoritarianism that you see now, it's a response to the fact that communication has become much more powerful than it ever has been.
Well, it is. But, we were talking about, World War II earlier and cancel culture in specific. And let me tell a couple of stories. So, one of the things, and you basically, people who lose historical conflicts get written out of history very easily. And so you don't understand the age of what we call cancel culture. And so, for example, just as, I'll give you two examples. One is a woman named Bella Dodd, completely forgotten by history. She was a member of the U.S. Politburo, of the CPUSA. She was a school teacher in New York's communist school teacher in New York City, very like my grandmother, a little more successful in the party. She becomes a member of the Politburo. She's a member of the faction of Earl Browder, who is basically pushing the popular front line of unity between liberals and communists. They win the war, World War II ends, and there's a split between the liberals and communists, sort of like the Sino-Soviet split, in some ways. And sort of competing factions of progressivism. And as a result, Stalin, who controls the American Communist Party, purges its leadership. Browder is purged, and Bella Dodd has to be purged. And the way in which they purge Bella Dodd is very interesting. You can read it in her autobiography, School of Darkness. They basically accuse her of being unfair to her Puerto Rican building superintendent. In fact, they accuse her of what was not at the time called racial chauvinism, but actually racism. Of course, this is completely untrue. And so if you wanted to be tried in a kangaroo court, and they had process within this party, literally, they had kangaroo courts. If you wanted to be tried in a kangaroo court for racism in the West in the 1940s, you had to be on the Politburo of the Communist Party. Fast forward about 30 years, there's a book that was republished recently called The Romance of American Communism by a lady named Vivian Gornick, also a Russian Jewish communist of Russian Jewish, extraction. Gornick grew up in the party in the 50s, and in the 70s, she falls out of pure communism. She becomes a new leftist feminist. This is not an anti-leftist book, which is one of the things that makes it so valuable. It was recently republished by NYRB, so you can get your hands on a copy easily. And she's talking about cancel culture in the 70s and, and the 60s, really. And, one of the things these gifted kids, these brilliant people did in the party was they constantly canceled each other. Long before, and Gornick would go in this amazing oral history, and she would speak to someone, and they would be like, "Oh, the cancellation, person A, oh, the cancellation was the worst. It was so terrible. You got expelled from the party, and your friends would ignore you in the grocery store. It was awful." And then they talked to person B, and person B would be, "Oh my God, it was so bad." And the worst of them was person A, and this, so it sort of became this kind of circular firing squad, which wasn't done with bullets in the same way as Stalin, but was done, by cancellation. So just to sort of broaden this out a little bit,
Well, that's why I always say to people, the late Soviet Union wasn't Stalinism, but it was exactly that. Which is why what's happening now.
You would lose your job. You're just like, "Oh my God,
it happened to my grandfather."
Yeah.
Right. So I always make this point to people in the West that this isn't new, and here's the parallel that you may want to think about when you're engaging.
This isn't new, but let me tell you a couple of other stories. So Browder, I read this somewhere, and unfortunately, I need a better historical researcher to dig this reference back up because I can't find it now, but it did in fact happen. Browder is making a secret speech to the party, to the American Politburo in the mid-30s. And he's recounting the achievements of the comrades. And he's like, one of the things that we've done, of course, they sort of took over Hollywood screenwriting and made it almost a union shop of party writers. But one of the things he says is we have people in all the major publishers, and anti-communist books can no longer be published. And when I read material from the 30s and 40s, and I've read quite a bit of it, of course, you probably heard the story of like Animal Farm couldn't be published.
Oh,
yeah.
It goes far. But Orwell.
Well, this is what I always say to people, right? Read the preface to Animal Farm. If you wanna understand what censorship actually is, read the preface.
Right.
He talks about it. It's not somebody saying this book must be burned. It's the fact that you can't publish anything without anyone ever telling you why.
That's right. That's right. And it goes far, beyond Orwell. Orwell, is still kind of in sympathy with these groups. He doesn't get like super canceled.
Yeah.
But, when you look at American publishing in the 20s, it goes all the way from, all this communist stuff, the New Masses. Go to Marxist.org and read the archive of the New Masses. It's like the New Yorker for communists in 1930, which is to say the New Yorker. Sorry. and joking. And you'll just see the mind of the present in the past. If you're looking for people who have the same worldview as the average American college student in 2023, and you're looking for those people in 1923, there's very few of them. They're overwhelmingly social elites. You'll find them in places like Greenwich Village. I always advise people to watch the film Reds, which is a very, with Warren Beatty as John Reed, John Reed, only American buried in the wall of the Kremlin. And you basically see these people with these insanely modern attitudes. They live like people in San Francisco. Their love lives are like the love lives of people in San Francisco. These are completely modern people, and they're a very small minority, and they basically set out to take power. So here's a couple of examples that are sort of a little outside of the normal space of like anti-wokeness. So basically, this thing with the publishers is done, and this sort of kind of defines what it means to be like mainstream media. What it means to be mainstream publishing is that you kind of went through this filtration, this coordination. It was a very different process in Nazi Germany, but this ideological coordination, which was centralized in Nazi Germany, and except for the CPUSA, which is long gone. It was decentralized in this country. Wokeness is decentralized, but it achieves the same, purpose as, I'm going to butcher the German, Gleichschaltung, which is basically turning everything Nazi that, happened in the Third Reich. My favorite example of this is a wonderful writer, Victor Klemperer, Do you know the name? He was a Jew who survived the Third Reich because he was married to an Aryan, and his wife was his wife was an Aryan. He was a linguist, and so he wrote this wonderful book called Language of the Third Reich. He wound up in East Germany, so his works were not. He was actually a member of the East German Parliament later, and so his works, were not widely known until the 90s. And he has this one story in which he had a cat. The cat does not survive the war. It's a somewhat sad story. He had a cat, and he subscribed to a cat magazine. And in 1931, his cat magazine was all about cats. But by 1935, it was all about the German cat. And so, you've started to see the German cat everywhere. And so here's one other story about basically
Curtis, can I just interrupt you just a second?
Yes.
Because the points you're making, I really agree with.
Yes.
I agree with the authoritarian element of it. The problem I have is the monarchy, and you saying we need a monarchy. Yet you have used the example in previous interviews of Google being a monarchy.
That's right.
Yet Google are one of the instruments that silences people online. So doesn't that contradict your entire argument?
So Google, I'm a Silicon Valley person. I'm sort of very familiar with kind of the way this thinking has evolved over time. And, where these sort of centralized social media providers came out of, everyone who started these things had this kind of 90s light libertarian ideology of Silicon Valley that I used to believe in. And it used to be you could publish absolutely anything, on Blogger. And when you look at how these companies became these enforcers, it was quite unwilling. And they basically, now, the sort of, they didn't want to do this. And they basically sort of felt themselves under the same kind of decentralized constraint that basically gave us sort of the German cat.
Right.
And you'll notice, for example, that you have, and this is kind of one of the fundamental conundrums of our society. I coined the term the cathedral to refer to these kind of the mainstream intellectual, basically newspapers and academia. And one of the things you note is that this is nominally decentralized system with all these separate poles. In Nazi Germany, you have Goebbels and his Ministry of Enlightenment, and he's like, you must be enlightened this way, that way, right?
But not just to translate your point into sort of simpler language, what you're saying basically is it's decentralized. No one is sitting at the top going, everyone must have equity and diversity. No one's doing that. But everyone must have equity and diversity.
But everyone must have, and so you have the same effect that Goebbels was trying to generate.
Yeah.
But the mechanism is totally different.
Right.
And it's a fascinating question of what this mechanism is.
Okay, cool. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to, before we move on to locals and have the conversation there, let's use the last 10 minutes in a little bit more succinct, concrete way to talk about that mechanism. Why is it that we're now obsessed with the German cat? Why is it that the same ideological positions are being pushed on everybody from corporations, the media, parliament down the road from here, the church, right? I could, the NHS, everyone is ad hoc to a particular worldview. And you can even believe that's a great worldview and it's exactly, everyone needs equity and diversity and whatever. How does that happen?
Mechanism?
How's that happen?
What is the mechanism? There is no more important question.
Cool.
That is
Let's take 10 minutes very specifically and talk about that.
That is the most important question of the time. And the answer is because we're not a monarchy. And let me be really, specific and clear about that.
Hey Francis, do you want to protect your privacy?
Of course I do. Now that I'm an international celebrity who's appeared on hit shows like the Joe Rogan Experience, I have to protect myself from vicious people looking to tear me down. I'm the Michael Jackson of the internet.
Not the celebrity I would have gone for, but trust is important when picking a VPN.
I don't trust anyone after she left me. She took everything.
Francis, remember what your lawyer said.
Good point. You can trust ExpressVPN because they don't sell your data to advertisers. They've even created software called Trusted Server that means they can't store any data at all.
ExpressVPN uses Lightweight, a VPN protocol that makes user speeds faster than ever. ExpressVPN is now blazingly fast. You can watch HD videos with zero buffering.
Thousands of pounds in legal fees.
The great thing about ExpressVPN is that you don't need any technical skills to set it up, just like Francis. Fire up the app and it's one button to connect.
One tap on a button was all it needed for my entire life to disintegrate.
Loads of people are saying that ExpressVPN is the best VPN there is. Business Insider, The Verge, and many other tech journals rate ExpressVPN as the #1 VPN in the world. Go on, Francis.
Protect yourself with ExpressVPN. Use our link, expressvpn.com/trigger today and get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package.
That's expressvpn.com/trigger. Visit expressvpn.com/trigger to learn more.
She took everything.
Because we're not, Aristotle, let's go back to Aristotle. Aristotle is like, there are 3 forms of government: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. You have the rule of the one, the many, and the few. These are actually forms of power rather than forms of government. So these forms of power exist, in every society. You look at, the Kennedys in America, there's an element of monarchy there. But overwhelmingly, you have this fellow Michael Young, who wrote The Rise of the Meritocracy, a father of Toby Young, I believe, an Englishman, and we use this word meritocracy. We mean this sort of institutional oligarchy in which decisions are made through process. And the whole idea of the 20th century is essentially that politics has failed. The idea of politicians running the state is horrifying to people. It leads to Hitler. That's what happens. Hitler was elected more or less democratically as a politician, as a demagogue. And you're basically like, you know what? If we let elected politicians run the state, we get demagoguery, we get Hitler. It's all true. That's what happened. That's what we got, right? And so, the response to that was sort of to use the word democracy. When you talk about liberal democracy, civil society, sort of the world of George Soros. And, I think one thing that's worth reflecting on is the way we use the word democracy in politics. So you might notice that the word democracy has a very positive connotation and the word politics has a very negative connotation, and yet they're synonyms. And so when we say liberal democracy, civil society, what we really mean is that the government should be run by professors and journalists. And when those professors and journalists and civil servants, like my parents, are basically told what to do by politicians, let's say the politicians can even fire them, that's horrifying. That leads us down the road to Hitler. And so, the principle of this sort of, technocratic, meritocratic government is that the government should be ruled by experts. Mm-hmm. And the ideas of these experts exist in a marketplace of ideas, which is not the sort of democratic marketplace of ideas that gives us QAnon and, weird anti-vaxxer internet stuff. That's a terrible marketplace of ideas. Everything that people say about it is true. But the marketplace of ideas among informed experts. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you're just like, how could this go wrong? And let me give you an example that has nothing to do with wokeness, nothing to do with the German
Hold on,
cat.
let me just work through what you're saying so that the logic is clear. Well, it's very easy to see how that goes wrong, because if the idea of democracy is essentially that you can get rid of the coach, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't like the coach. Well, if the coach isn't actually in charge.
Yes. If the coach actually isn't in charge, the wires leading to the election
you can replace the coach, but the team is still going to be run the way that it's
by,
run.
By the managers, the trainers,
right.
Right. And so, and this is very old thing. This is, American progressivism, essentially, from the early part of the century. Going back in history, you have this sort of Gilded Age system in America, very like China, very corrupt, very effective, and the politicians are these scoundrels, these corrupt people, very uneducated, very bribed, things get done in a messy way. And, the old American elites, people like Henry Adams, for example, really the earliest progressives. The farther you go back in progressivism, the more I like these people. And they're just like, this society should be ruled by the best people in it, and these people are manifestly not the best people. They are not the experts. They are not the smartest people.
But who gets to judge who the best people are, Curtis?
Well, at present, who gets to judge who the best people are these institutions.
Right.
And so let me basically, the meritocracy, essentially, now it gets corrupted by, all this race stuff or whatever. But, let me give you an example of a problem that we're all familiar with and the effect in this. And that example is COVID. You'll remember COVID. And you've probably had
I'd rather not remember it. If
You've probably had COVID.
Yes.
And so I think it's fairly clearly established. It's not really a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's fairly clear that if it didn't happen, it could have happened. And here's how COVID happens. So first you have SARS-1, which basically jumps from a bat to a palm civet. It's very well established, very nasty disease. And this, SARS-1 is a problem. It almost escapes. It almost becomes COVID, and it kills about 20% of the people that have it. It makes Delta COVID, which was a nasty disease, look like the common cold. It's an important problem. The way science is funded, specifically science, including, for example, virology. Virology is not social science. It's very clearly scientific. It's a hard science. And in the principle of the second half of the 20th century, the way that science is funded is sort of, consistent with this kind of government by experts principle, and the thing about an oligarchy is it almost looks like it's no government at all. It's just like, no, there's no power here. It's just science. It's not power. It's just science. But when you look more closely at power, there's always human beings involved. And so the result of SARS-1 is that virology becomes important, and specifically bat coronaviruses become important. And the way science, having dropped out of my PhD program, but some people think of me as a computer scientist. The way science works is you get funding for things that are important and things that matter. And so within virology, basically, people realized that they could get quite a bit of grants by referring to this very real problem of bat coronaviruses. And they basically said, well, this is a serious problem. We deserve a number of pounds to study it. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, what if this happened again? What if a bat coronavirus emerged? Well, let's go and find all the bat coronaviruses. Let's go to all the bat caves. They literally did this. Let's bring the viruses back. But the problem is these viruses are bat viruses. They don't naturally infect humans, but they can mutate to infect humans. But waiting for them to mutate is a very slow and random process. So what if we mutated them? And what if we trained them? What if we put a furin cleavage site in? What if we trained them to infect, humanized mice? What if we did this in a Chinese laboratory with very poor biosafety conditions? The Wuhan virus that's an American virus because it's funded by American science. These people were literally funded to do this research by American grants. And so when you talk to the virologists who did this, they're like, well, we need to predict the emergence of well, what happens if you predict it? What do you do? Well, we predicted it, all right. And it's like you find, come home and you find your 10-year-old setting fire to the kitchen curtains. And you're like, why are you setting fire to the curtains? He's like, well, there's a lot of fires in the kitchen. Cooking happens. There are accidents. What if the curtains caught fire? Could we get out? Could the dog get out? So gain of function research, at least in this context, is clearly a bad idea. And yet this bad idea, which, any fool on the street can see is a bad idea, basically succeeds in the marketplace of ideas that, consists of professional virologists with IQs of 150 who've trained for many, many years to study this. And the question of why this bad idea succeeds in the marketplace of ideas is fundamental to the question of why bad ideas, rule our society today and how we tend, the difference between gain of function research and the idea that colleges should discriminate in admissions by the skin color of the people applying to them. They're both equally ridiculous ideas,
Yep.
right? And how do these ridiculous ideas succeed? And when we use words like authoritarianism, which is basically sort of an anti-monarchical word, we're basically looking at the sort of the pathologies of monarchies, which are systems very alien to and very opposed to the kind of oligarchy that runs our democratic societies today. And monarchies, when they fail, when they're bad, and any system of government democracy, oligarchy, or monarchy can be good or bad. Basic point of Aristotle. When bad monarchies distort the marketplace of ideas, it's overwhelmingly by repressing good ideas. And the way that we got here is very different from that. It's by a system that promotes bad ideas. Moreover, it promotes bad ideas not through a sort of conscious monarchical plan. There's no little council, the supreme elders of something sitting in a little room saying, we're going to, fund this bad idea because we like bad ideas. That would be better in some ways because it would be easy to get rid of those people. But there's no center. There's no little cabal. There's no dictatorship. There's sort of none of that. There's just a system that structurally rewards these bad ideas. And it structurally rewards these bad ideas, first of all, by separating authority from responsibility. And so, someone like, Fauci, who's almost, a little monarch within this oligarchical structure of process, and who is really, critical in, sort of authorizing and continuing this gain of function research, will never be held accountable. And so you have this kind of division, when bad ideas are accountable, they are not favored in the evolutionary Darwinian contest of ideas. But when you look at the way bad ideas are promoted, and it's simply enough to not have that accountability. And when you don't have that accountability, the attraction of bad ideas, not the sort of repulsive, if you think about like electromagnetic force, you have attraction and repulsion. And what happens is basically you have these bad ideas and they feel good for some reason. Within virology, for example, gain of function research feels good because everyone's doing it. It's the way to get grants. And if you say no one should be doing this, you're basically saying your fellow virologists should not be funded. Ooh. That's going to be hard. Ooh. All right. But the thing is, when you basically extend that outside the circles of experts, essentially, when these experts are promoting policies that strengthen power, that reward them, they're like, my field is important, my field matters, more must be done. And then you extend this to sort of the broader world. Where does this sort of culture of victimology come from? Whether you're looking, we talked about communism, progressivism earlier, and if you look at, for example, the Scottsboro Boys case of, which is promoted by communists in the 1930s, you connect that to George Floyd. There's sort of this clear thread there. And there's, providing people with the feeling of saying, I'm the defender of the victim. Mm-hmm. I am the white knight. I am the paladin. I am standing up, for... And the effect of these ideas may be terrible. I mean, I think the effect of the George Floyd riots on, the African-American community in America is straightforwardly negative. There's very clear social science statistics, massive numbers of deaths from depolicing, right? But that doesn't have an accountability impact on the marketplace of ideas. What impacts the marketplace of ideas is...
to translate what you're saying into simple language, the people who push that narrative didn't get the comeuppance they should have got.
Yes.
They were not delegitimized, discredited.
They were not delegitimized, but they felt that positive feeling of feeling incredibly good about it. Their hearts felt warm. They felt important. They felt like they mattered. They felt like it gave them meaning.
Right.
And so, the sort of marketing that kind of meaning, which is confined in the 1930s to a very small elite set of like American communists, including my forebears, basically becomes mass market in, the sort of George Floyd experience. Now every suburban housewife feels like they matter, like they're standing up. And what they don't realize is that that's a mechanism that not only promotes bad ideas, the bad ideas displace good ideas, and you get this kind of monoculture, which looks exactly like the kind of monoculture in, at least structurally, I'm not saying whether, it looks exactly like the kind of monoculture that's enforced through repressive means by an authoritarian government such as Nazi Germany. But the mechanism that basically creates that coordination of ideology is promotion rather than suppression. It's attraction rather than repulsion. And it's inevitable in an oligarchical, meritocratic structure of government. And so when these oligarchies were established, you had these marketplaces of ideas. Professors had never been involved in government. The idea that professors should run the government in 1900 was as absurd as saying postmen should run the government. And because these marketplaces of ideas in academia were not corrupted by power, they were flat and they were excellent. And people are like, okay, I have these corrupt politicians elected by, democracy, terrible result. We'll still use the name democracy just as we still use the name monarchy, but politicians are awful, they're corrupt. What about these unbiased, experts? But the thing is, you give power to the experts and power corrupts them. And suddenly they develop these conflicts of interest. They become sort of corrupted. And basically, when you give power to the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of ideas corrupts itself, and you get basically a world of absolutely terrible ideas.
Curtis, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Last question we always ask is, what's the one thing we're not talking about as a society that we really should be?
I'm going to go back to something that I said earlier about technology. And I think the thing that we're not talking about when we talk about technology is, technology's destruction of labor demand and the way it makes, absolutely ruthlessly acts to make human beings useless. And I think one of the reasons why the future needs a kind of state power. I used to be a libertarian. I love being a libertarian. I describe myself as a recovering libertarian. I'll always be a libertarian in a way. And one of the things that has happened to these societies is that, you have a society, go to the tower blocks, 10 miles from here, you have these buildings full of absolutely useless people, and they're just decaying in the most horrific way. And, this is a very long train of history that starts with, Goldsmith's deserted village, like all the labor demand for like the local blacksmith disappears. And then, his grandchildren have this horrific Dickensian existence where they're used as human robots. And now we don't even need human robots anymore because we have robots. And then suddenly along come these large language models and they start killing the demand for basically what David Graeber called bullshit jobs. Suddenly, like, paper pushing is under attack. And you're like, whoa, I thought I could have a career pushing papers. And suddenly you can't. And so, we have, the system of technology is, economists refer to, technology as basically productivity. You're just like increasing productivity is good, more productivity is better, more stuff is better than less stuff. And we come into this economy where there's actually demand for like 10 guys who write, 10 men and women who write the large language models. And then the large language models start writing themselves. And that's the real AI disaster, is that you don't need people anymore. It's not that they'll like revolt against people in some sort of golem myth. It's that you don't need people anymore. And so, the only way to prevent that is a sort of, regime which says, okay,
Curtis, we better wrap up because there's a protest against you.
When you're basically saying, the purpose of government is the health of the people, not the luxury of the people, not the wealth of the people, but the health of the people. You go back to thinkers like John Ruskin and Carlyle, who were like, wait a second, power needs to step in and power needs to basically regulate the economy to make people needed. And that's a very hard and deep question, and I'm sure people are protesting. Are they protesting me? I hope not.
I don't know. We'll find out. Curtis Yarvin, thank you so much for coming on, and we've got a great section for locals with Curtis coming right up. Head on over there, and we'll see you there.